In my previous videos, I've talked about how Western media often paints Indian democracy as being on the decline, pointing to issues like the banning of opposition leader Rahul Gandhi from elections, the rise of Hindutva, intolerance against the Muslim population, media intimidation, and the centralization of executive power in India. But today, we're not focusing on India.
People who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
We'll explore the question, is American democracy dying, and how Western media often glosses over significant issues within their own countries, while focusing on external criticism, which is an example of how they have departed from ethical standards. In their reporting, the media often fails to address significant domestic issues, such as the severe drug addiction crisis in the United States. This crisis is frequently called an epidemic and is fueled by the widespread abuse of substances like opioids, methamphetamines, and especially fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid. New skin-rotting drug, called tranq-dope, is a drug mixture that consists of fentanyl and xylazine, a veterinary drug not intended for human use. This skin-rotting drug is known for zombifying people's bodies. The zombie drug first appeared in Philadelphia, before spreading west to cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. Over the years, the country has witnessed a dramatic rise in overdose deaths, with fentanyl being a leading cause, due to its potency and prevalence. Meanwhile, the US government is busy focusing on international conflicts, likely because there's a lot of profit to be made from weapons sales. And of course, the media loves to jump on the latest war or military issues, giving it wall-to-wall coverage. And domestic issues like the drug epidemic, not so much, those get the occasional, passing by mention, as if they were just another boring detail in the background. It's almost like the media prefers to chase flashy headlines, rather than deal with the less exciting and ongoing problems, right at home. It's surprising how Western media conveniently overlooks the slow decline of democratic principles in the US, while swiftly criticizing other countries on various issues, like human rights, religious freedom, etc. For example, the influence of identity politics in US education reflects broader societal debates about race, gender, and social justice. A federal judge in Maryland said, parents in Montgomery County can't take their kids out of class when LGBTQ-themed books are read. Parents got upset because they feel these books clash with their religious beliefs. They worry that talking about gender identity and sexuality in school pressures their kids to accept these ideas that go against what they're taught at home, thereby infringing on their First Amendment rights to religious freedom. Take another instance, the US and the West supply weapons to their favored parties in conflict zones. For example, US-made weapons are used by Israel against Palestine, resulting in the deaths of many innocent citizens, which is a clear violation of human rights. However, in the Russia-Ukraine war, we see a different narrative unfolding. Western media were quick to denounce Russia, focusing on its weakening economy and portraying it as pathetic, while condemning it for human rights violations. They also failed to tell you is that Ukraine is really just a pawn in a larger geopolitical game, with the US and its Western allies pulling the strings. The Western media also ignores the fact that how Russia is actually becoming stronger, even while facing off against 30 NATO countries, and is getting closer to China, which could lead to a new world order. They also criticized other countries like India for abstaining from UN votes and continuing to buy oil from Russia, as if India should simply follow the US lead and abandon its own interests. Just like the NATO countries did. Look where that got them, their economies are crumbling. One example is Britain's economy, which is now struggling. And if the war continues, who knows what will happen next. Yet, India has consistently advocated for resolving conflicts through diplomacy and peace talks, standing firm on its principle that we're not in an era of war. What's striking here is that the media seem to bypass a crucial question. Why did this war start in the first place? Instead of exploring the root causes, the narrative is often simplified to cast Russia as the villain. After the Cold War, Western leaders, including US Secretary of State James Baker, suggested NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward during talks on German reunification. Despite informal promises made by Western leaders, that NATO would not expand eastward, NATO did start to include Eastern European countries in 1999, such as Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Here, Russia mistakenly took the oral assurances seriously. Russia, feeling that the West breached these understandings, led to conflicts and geopolitical friction in the following decades, including the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Russia sees Ukraine as a vital buffer zone and wants to keep Western military forces out by maintaining its influence there. And the West argues the expansion was driven by Eastern European countries seeking security and stability, and NATO's open door policy allows any eligible European country to join. Nobody would want such a big army present near its border. Did the US ever tolerate this kind of behavior? Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the US took a hard stance against Soviet missiles in Cuba, even though the US first placed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, which could strike the Soviet Union. Or look at how the US reacted when China began militarizing the South China Sea, considering it a direct threat to American influence in the region. The irony is that while the media loves to call out other countries for their shortcomings, it often overlooks the challenges facing American democracy, despite its core values of multiculturalism and diversity. The media has largely abandoned ethical standards, often showing bias by aligning with specific political ideologies or parties.
Look as his character is stabbed to death.
I'd like to punch him in the face. I said if we were in high school, I'd take him behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
Do something about your dad's immigration practices, you feckless.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
People need to start taking to the streets. This is a dictator.
You know, there needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
I thought he should have punched him in the face. I said, even if you lost, he insulted your wife.
Yes.
He came down the escalator and called Mexicans rapists and murderers. He said, well, what do you think I should have done? I said, I think you should have punched him in the face and then gotten out of the race. You would have been a hero.
Let's check out the most recent report of Western media about the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump in Pennsylvania on July 13th, as a result of which the former head of the White House was wounded in the ear and one of the visitors died. Initial reports from major outlets like CNN emphasized dramatic headlines such as "Secret Service rushed Trump off stage after he falls at rally." CNN chose the word "fall," not "assassination attempt." Let's be clear, it was an assassination attempt. He's not Joe Biden, after all, who falls in the stage or shake hander with invisible person. The next headline, Trump injured in incident at rally. Incident? Really? The man survived an attempt on his life. This was a devastating day for America. Social media buzzed with reactions, ranging from shock to fear, and many are expressing their support and concerns for Trump's safety. In another example of media coverage, Forbes, which is an American business magazine, wrote, "Will surviving gunfire be Donald Trump's next appeal to black voter?" The notion that being shot could somehow enhance political appeal was deemed highly insensitive and inappropriate. The idea was so controversial and offensive that Forbes ultimately decided to delete the article. Throughout history, political violence has targeted US leaders, with notable assassinations, including Abraham Lincoln in 1865, James Garfield in 1881, William McKinley in 1901, and John F. Kennedy in 1963. Some presidents, like Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1912 and Ronald Reagan in 1981, survived assassination attempts. While past political and media reactions acknowledged the gravity of these events, today's coverage seems less respectful. Comparing the recent attempted assassination of Donald Trump to Reagan's 1981 shooting reveals a decline in media integrity. CNN's sensationalist coverage of the Trump's assassination attempt, using it as clickbait rather than recognizing its seriousness, reflects this change. To add insult to injury, CNN also publishes an analysis piece with a headline that Trump is favored in the election, but Biden still has a chance to win. While they continue to peddle the narrative that democracy is thriving in the Western US, but the reality is starkly different. Political polarization, misinformation, and rising violence are ripping the very fabric of American and Western society apart. For example, in recent years, Europe has seen several major protests. And the war in Ukraine has certainly played a part in fueling the current protests and crisis in Europe. For example, the European farmers' protests, 2023, the Dutch farmers' protests began in 2019, with farmers opposing nitrogen emissions regulations that they feel threaten their livelihoods. In 2023, the European farmers' protests erupted as farmers in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Germany, France, Italy, Greece, and Spain protested against Ukrainian grain imports, citing unfair competition. Many farmers are struggling because of a combination of challenging factors, ranging from crippling debt, the pressures of retailers and agrochemical companies, and extreme weather patterns.
Stay still! Get out! Climate criminals! Climate criminals!
Young people inspired by Greta Thunberg are holding Fridays for Future rallies to demand stronger climate action from governments, with students from the Netherlands, Australia, and Poland also joined. Similarly, Extinction Rebellion is engaging in acts of civil disobedience across Europe, urging urgent measures to tackle the climate crisis. Campus protests by pro-Palestinian activists have spread across Europe, as some call for a break in academic ties with Israel over the war. Germany, Europe's largest economy, is heavily reliant on cheap energy, which has been disrupted by the destruction of Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. The conflict in Ukraine has caused inflation surges, economic crisis deepens, and refugee crisis, forcing millions to seek asylum in Europe and pressuring countries for humanitarian aid and integrate them into society. The recent EU parliamentary elections have led to protests and unrest across Europe. Many afraid it will affect immigration, security, and green policies, as right-wing parties gain support in areas of public dissatisfaction. In France, widespread strikes occurred as taxi drivers, air traffic controllers, civil servants, and teachers demanded more purchasing power, job creation, and an end to disruptive competition in traditional industries. During protests against French pension reform, black bloc groups dressed in black opposed capitalism and President Macron, and clashed violently with police at the forefront of the marches. Additionally, there were protests against the government's law permitting same-sex marriage. There is widespread anger and perceptions of inequality among the French population, with President Macron being seen as favoring the wealthy. These examples illustrate some of the challenges Europe is currently facing. The US is in a self-destructive mode, with politics slowly destroying the system from within.
Donald Trump's campaign is obsessed with the past, not the future. He's willing to sacrifice our democracy.
Now we have a president who's a great danger to democracy. He really is. He is a danger to democracy, and at a level like few people have seen.
US politics has been plagued by deepening divisions, rising anger, and an alarming decline in the health of its democracy. Once proud American democracy is facing a systemic crisis, and is accelerating its decline. The system of checks and balances, which used to be strong, is now at risk because of constant political fighting. The impact is spreading to all fronts in domestic politics, the economy and society, posing a mortal threat to the legitimacy and health of capitalism. American democracy is facing issues such as political polarization, money-driven politics, erosion of free speech, and a judiciary out of touch with public opinion. Money has become a dominant force in US politics, leading to a system where the wealthy have an outsized influence on elections and governance. The 2022 midterm elections, costing over $16.7 billion, exemplify this trend. The majority of elected lawmakers won by spending large sums, often from undisclosed sources. A small number of wealthy families and billionaires contribute significant portions of election funds, mainly through super PACs. Despite the high costs, this has not resulted in effective governance, but rather fueled self-serving politics and increased economic inequality. The public feels powerless, leading to a rise in populism and a loss of faith in political parties and the government. It labeled regressive democracies in 2022 by a Swedish think tank. Domestic polarization influencing foreign policy. The intense political divisions between Democrats and Republicans in the US have extended beyond domestic politics. it affects the country's foreign policy decisions and actions. This means that the US's approach to international issues is often driven more by internal partisan conflicts than by a cohesive or strategic foreign policy. Both parties remain paralyzed by extreme polarization and self-interest, hindering essential reforms. Voting restrictions, election fraud, and public distrust in the government are accelerating its decline. A silent civil war has taken root in the US, driven by a range of issues. Here are some notable examples. George Floyd protests, 2020, nationwide protests organized by the Black Lives Matter movement in response to George Floyd's death, highlighted systemic racism and police brutality, calling for significant police reforms. Women's March, 2017, the march arose following Trump's election, where his controversial statements about women and conservative policies raised concerns about potential threats to women's rights and other social issues under his administration, drawing an estimated 4.6 million participants. While widely seen as an anti-Trump protest, but it was call for social change, or call for woke culture, and this was seen as having a lack of support within the Trump administration. Their mission statement expressed support for gender and pay equality, LGBTQ and civil rights, affordable healthcare, environmental awareness, and reproductive freedom, among other issues that was seen as having a lack of support within the incoming administration. Repairing damaged democracy involves fostering a strong sense of identity and a commitment to the common good, both of which are currently lacking. At present, American society is overly focused on identity politics, or is promoting a particular set of values that are disagreed by normal people. American democracy is increasingly threatened by escalating violence and division, with partisan gridlock and deepening distrust undermining its legitimacy. Exacerbating global conflicts. Polarized approach makes US foreign policy more extreme and confrontational. Rather than seeking diplomatic solutions or promoting stability, US actions intensify conflicts or create new ones. Some political factions advocate for aggressive stances against rival nations rather than seeking diplomatic solutions. For example, Iraq War, Vietnam War, Korean War, Libya intervention, Yemen, Russia-Ukraine War, Israel-Palestine conflict. Those are significant past and current conflicts, where diplomatic efforts could potentially have played a larger role. Escalating partisan conflicts. Political polarization in the US has gotten much worse, with extreme groups popping up in both major parties. This split has made it hard to reach policy agreements, and the country is now being called a bi-national state because of these deep divides. Politicians are focusing more on party interests than what's good for the nation, like with the Mar-a-Lago raid on Trump and the investigations into Biden. Party politics now often mix with race and identity issues, leading some to think violence is acceptable for political reasons. As a result, making laws has slowed down a lot, and democratic norms are breaking down because politicians are willing to sacrifice democratic principles just to keep or gain power. This puts American democracy at serious risk. Freedom of speech limitations. Despite claiming to uphold free speech, the US restricts speech that opposes government or corporate interests. For example, in December 2022, Twitter CEO Elon Musk and journalist Matt Taibbi exposed the Twitter files, which showed that the US government monitors all social media platforms closely. The US government scrutinizes social media, senses sensitive information, and collaborates with big media companies and the FBI to monitor and control public opinion, to suppress certain accounts and topics, all the while giving the US military the green light to spread disinformation online. Meta's report revealed that individuals linked to the US military were behind a covert online propaganda campaign. This campaign aimed to support the US and its allies, while opposing countries like Russia, China, and Iran. Meta found and removed several accounts, pages, and groups on Facebook and Instagram involved in this operation because they violated the platform's rules against fake or misleading behavior. These actions reveal that true free speech in the US is compromised. What are your thoughts on the media criticizing other countries' internal issues while using sensationalism and bias to distract from America's own democratic decline and internal crises? Isn't it the media's role to help repair domestic democracy instead? I'm afraid if these trends continue, democracy in the US and the West is in serious jeopardy. Forget about saving democracy, there won't even be room for communism, which the US is trying to stop by any means necessary. If things keep going this way, there won't be any countries left to govern. Instead, we'll be ruled by rebel factions, storming the White House with firepower, much like the movie Civil War, a gripping near-future war epic.